Hello, everybody. I am excited today to talk to you about your swim technique, specifically focusing on stroke rate and the assessment of that rate and the drills we can do to improve your stroke rate. So let's talk about that. But I first want to mention that obviously this is geared towards improving your overall performance, but I can't overstate the fact that it really needs to be coupled with the idea of assessing and understanding your distance per stroke or the number of strokes you take per length in order to make those complete changes. Stroke rate and distance per stroke really need to be integrated together in order to make this change. So be sure to look at and review my distance per stroke presentations to get the full understanding of the combination of these two particular elements of your stroke. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're talking about stroke rate today. And really, stroke rate is the number of strokes you take per minute. I did want to mention just briefly that the distance per stroke, which needs to be integrated in this conversation, is really the distance you travel each stroke. And that's best measured by the number of strokes you take per length. And I get into depth on that in my distance per stroke presentation. And of course, I'll mention again, the assessment and development of your stroke rate and distance per stroke really go hand in hand, so it's important to understand both as you move forward. Okay, so when we talk about stroke rate and the balance between the two, we can see here on the individual on the left really has a very low stroke rate and a high distance per stroke. So the turnover is really slow and methodical, long distance per stroke versus the person on the right. And that person on the right has a higher stroke rate, not necessarily excessively high, but they have a very short distance per stroke. Okay, it's just not effective and not efficient. Neither one of these types of stroke technique is effective. And of course, we're here to discuss on how to improve upon those. Okay. All right. So what's the purpose of making corrections to your stroke rate? Really, there's several things. First is you want to make changes to potential dead spot that you might have in your stroke, and those dead spots really occur because of the excessive or very slow stroke rate or excessive distance per stroke, and it occurs when there's no propulsion in your stroke occurring at any given moment in time. Also wanted the corrections here will also make changes to your stroke mechanics, such as your reach and or your catch, which you may be lengthening or shortening that reach in order to perform the catch appropriately. Kick and body rotation will also potentially need to be changed in order to affect your stroke rate. And of course, your breathing and the timing of your breathing will also need to change in order to make some effect on your stroke rate. So changing stroke rate just isn't a matter of having faster arm turnover. There's a lot of mechanical things that need to be changed in order to make a increase or decrease in your stroke rate effective. Okay, and we'll cover those as we go through the presentation. So let's talk about stroke rate correction. What do we need to do to make the correction to the stroke rate? First is you need to assess your current stroke rate. What is that? Is it too fast? Is it too slow? Is it just right? And that will take into account what your distance per stroke is and how fast you are swimming. And I'll cover that here in a minute. But let's say there are some changes you need to make to your stroke rate. So there are certain drills that you can do, certain ways that you can make this effect happen. First is to use an underwater metronome. That is probably the primary and best way to make changes to your stroke rate, and that's not necessarily a drill. And I'll cover what a underwater metronome is and what it does for you. But you can complete some sets to change your stroke rate in order to create some muscle memory and the psychological feeling for what a slower or faster stroke rate means to you. And then you can include some swim sets with bands where you secure your feet with a band and eliminate the kicking. And these particular swim sets are really designed around improving your stroke rate, enhancing the turnover. Okay, so let's talk about assessment first. There are a couple of options to consider. The first option, probably the best option, is to use an underwater metronome. And using this underwater metronome, basically you put this device underneath your cap and it sends off a beeping signal based off of the rate that you set it at. And in order to assess what your rate is, typically what your rate is, but also what a kind of a sweet spot or optimal rate would be for you based off of how fast you swim and your distance per stroke. So in order to make that assessment, typically you set the metronome about 5 beats lower than what you feel like your normal stroke rate is. So you may need to swim several 50s with the metronome in order to establish what your current stroke rate is. And then once you've kind of established what that current stroke rate is based off of those moderate effort 50s, then set the metronome at 5 beats lower than that. And then you'll go through this sequence of swimming 12 to 16 50s with 10 seconds rest. And in each 50, you'll increase that stroke rate by 1 in order to find out where your sweet spot 50 is and what the time is, what your stroke rate is, and how you feel. And I'll talk about that here in more depth as we go. So when you do this assessment, you're going to track the number of strokes you take per 25. You're going to track your effort for each 50 and the time it takes to do each 50. And you mark the 50s which have the fastest and felt the most comfortable. That's kind of your sweet spot. And then that sweet spot is used for the stroke rate for future swim sets in order to make potential improvements. So if you chart that out, you can use this chart as your guide, where let's say you establish your first 50 to be at a stroke rate of 60. So you set the metronome at 60, and then for that particular 50, you count the number of strokes you took per 25, how fast it took, and your perceived effort. Rest your 10 seconds and then set the rate at 61 and complete the same process, and do that all the way up until you're about, there's a range of about 15 different 50s and 15 or 16 different 50s. And that way you can get an idea of where you felt the most comfortable and you had the fastest time swimming those 50s. And that would be at least your base stroke rate, and then you can use that for determining where you're going to make your improvements. Okay, the other option really is a little more convoluted. You can take a friend or your coach and have him or her on deck with a stopwatch. You would complete 2 100 yards moderate effort swims at 10 seconds rest. Moderate effort being something you could hold for about 1,000 yards. And then that coach or friend tracks the number of strokes you take in 10 seconds during each of the 4 lengths. And then you take the average number of strokes and determine your stroke rate. Kind of a very simplistic way of assessing stroke rate. And you can see here down in the example, if you took 11 strokes per 10 seconds on average, then your stroke rate is 66. Okay, so what do we do with that? Once we get the stroke rate established, we need to make some corrections to that and see what we can do to make improvements or changes to that stroke rate. First, you need to understand some characteristics about stroke rate. Then you can use a chart that I have here in this presentation to assess your goal, whether you want to change the stroke rate, make it faster or make it slower, and then include your stroke rate in swim workouts depending on the swim distance. And then definitely through all of this, make sure that you're considering how fast you're swimming and what your distance per stroke is when you make changes to your stroke rate. So definitely important to review the distance per stroke presentation before you do any corrections to your stroke rate, because when you make changes to stroke rate, you also potentially will make changes to your distance per stroke and vice versa. Okay, so let's talk about characteristics of stroke rate. So stroke rate, if you have a really slow stroke rate, then typically your stroke rate is around 55 or less, and typically you have a very high distance per stroke or a very low number of strokes per 25, which typically might be less than 15. And that's not always the case, and that's not always bad. But when you consider that, when you couple that with how fast you're swimming, and if you have a very slow swim time, then and you have both these other characteristics of a slow stroke rate and less than 15 strokes per length, then you definitely need to make changes and enhance your stroke rate. On the other hand, if you have a very fast stroke rate, which I'll quantify as being around 85 or faster, and again, that's not always necessarily true for very high level national class, world class swimmers. They often swim at that level or faster. But for most people, you have a very, the stroke rate might be 85 or more. You have a very low distance per stroke or a high number of strokes per 25, which is usually 25 or greater. Okay. And the slow swim times relative to stroke rate, in the chart, you'll see that. And obviously the goal here is to slow your stroke rate down. Okay. All right. So let's talk about this chart I've mentioned several times. So in this chart, this takes into account how fast you're swimming and what your stroke rate might be for those times. And this is put out by Swim Smooth organization out of Australia, which has done a lot of research in this particular area. And you can see as your time gets faster per 100, then typically your stroke rate goes up, both on the low end and the high end. And if you fall somewhere here in the middle, then typically you're within a normal range for most swimmers at this pace. I always recommend that if you fall towards the bottom end of this range, that you make changes to your technique and form in order to improve your stroke rate and try to get it towards the top end of these ranges. If you're swimming really fast down in these 110, 1 minute range per 100, and you're at the low end here, you really have to assess how effective you are in racing in order to make those changes and whether they're worth it to you to make those changes. So, okay. So this is definitely a very good tool to look at in terms of how, once you've made your stroke rate established, and you can take that number and look at where it falls within the time frame or in the chart here based off of how fast you swim, and then start to make judgments as to whether you need to make changes or not to that stroke rate. But let's say you do. Let's say you may need to make changes, and those changes include increasing your stroke rate. Okay, so increasing your stroke rate really means that you really definitely need to use a metronome to make that happen. And just because of the number of sets and the number of times that you have to engage in changing your stroke rate really occurs over a long period of time. And the only way to really assess your stroke rate is to use an underwater metronome. Okay. So when you're trying to increase your stroke rate, a couple of things in terms of mechanics that you need to focus on. One is less body roll, shorter reach, earlier catch. Those all change relative to increasing your stroke rate. Okay. When you talk about decreasing and ultimately you talked about decreasing your distance per stroke when you increase your stroke rate. That's not always true. Oftentimes that is the end result of that, is to decrease your distance per stroke. And you might find that when you do these sets, such as 25 to 75-yard sets, you want to have an increase in stroke rate of 3 to 4. When you do sets of 100 and 150, you'll increase your stroke rate by 2 to 3, and 150 to 250-yard sets increase your stroke rate by 1 to 2. So by increasing your stroke rate in these shorter distances, you really start to enhance and increase that rate beyond what you've currently established. Okay. In order to do swim sets that reduce your stroke rate, again, use your underwater metronome. The goal, obviously, the goal is a slower stroke rate, and you're going to do sets really to increase your distance per stroke. Okay, so we're talking about the other side of the fence now, but that is ultimately usually what happens. And the focus really here is on greater body roll, longer reach, and delayed catch. So these type of sets would you would see, let's say for 25 to 250-yard sets, 2 to 3 stroke rate less per 25. Okay, and if you do anything that's 250 yards or more, then you might see a stroke rate of 1 to 2 per 50 less. So the goal really is that your stroke rate changes based off of the distances that you swim, but you can certainly incorporate those changes and set your metronome to the right stroke rate depending on how far you swim in each one of those sets. Okay, now let's talk about bands. Okay, so when we use bands and you strap those around your feet, this is the specific way to increase your stroke rate. It's not really designed to decrease your stroke rate. And the reason it increases your stroke rate is it increases your shoulder rotation in order to compensate for the lack of kick. It encourages an earlier catch, improves shoulder strength and power in the catch, all because you lack that kick because the feet are bound by the band. With using bands, typically swim sets are completed prior to the main set. They can be completed afterwards as well. Usually, as you're trying to increase your stroke rate, you do this 2 to 3 times a week. And example sets might be 8 times 25 with 10 seconds rest, 6 times 50 with 15 seconds rest, or some kind of pyramid set. So the goal here really is that you're increasing your stroke rate in order to compensate for the lack of kicking and also to manage the balance of your body, horizontal balance of your body in the water. Okay. Can be very difficult and very challenging for new swimmers. So it's important that you do these in very short sets in order to master the use of bands because of your lack of kicking. Okay, so let's talk about this idea of stroke rate and your swim set distances. I briefly mentioned this earlier that typically when you do swim sets, the shorter the swim set, the greater the increase in stroke rate changes that you can make. So anytime that you're doing sets of less than 100, you increase your stroke rate by 3 to 4 minutes. And when you do sets of 150 to 200, might be increasing your stroke rate by 2 to 3 minutes per minute. And 200-yard sets, you use your established stroke rate, or you may change it by just 1 to 2 a minute. When you do open water, I definitely suggest to utilize the metronome in open water. It will definitely give you a sense of what it is like to use a particular stroke rate in the pool versus out in open water. And I would use the established stroke rate to start with in open water, or maybe increase your stroke rate by 1 to 2 per minute if there's a lot of turbulence in the water. So it's important to use this metronome at different rates for different distances and for different settings. Okay, so that's kind of the bottom line with that slide. All right, so when we talk about making these corrections, obviously we're making these corrections to benefit your performance and just to kind of give you a sense of what that might be. So let's say you make a change to your stroke rate and you actually make it faster by a rate of about 3 to 6 per minute, but you keep your distance per stroke the same. Okay, sometimes that doesn't occur. When you make that change to your stroke rate, your distance per stroke may drop, but you don't want that to happen necessarily. You want to keep a constant distance per stroke, and if you do that, you could see gains of 3 to 5 seconds per 100. So quite a lot when these two combinations are made, where you keep your distance per stroke the same, but you improve your stroke rate. So definitely worthwhile to make these changes. Okay, I'm going to finish off this information, this discussion by talking about Zwolf. I mean, there's a lot of information in this presentation, and there's certainly a lot of concepts to wrap your head around. But so far, really, the goal is to increase your stroke rate by changing your mechanics and the way you reach, where your catch is, how fast you pull through your stroke, where you finish, what your rotation is like, various elements. And it's not just all about changing how fast your arm rotate in the water. Okay. Now, one way to kind of bring all this together in a nice little measurement tool is to use what's called Zwolf. It's just a combination, a name combination of swimming and golf. And really is the idea is to measure your swim efficiency. And the way in which you use this little measurement tool is you add the number of strokes taken per pool length and the time taken to swim that length. So if you swim at 25 and 30 seconds and take 10 strokes to swim that length of the pool, then you have a Zwolf score of 40. Okay, so what do you do with this Zwolf score? And what's the best way to come up with particular assessment of what is an appropriate Zwolf score? Because if you swim just 125 and you get this score, that's not really reflective of what you would do in your normal swim sets or out in open water in a triathlon. Okay, so some characteristics here of Zwolf. So ultimately, the lower the score, the better. And you can lower the score by lowering the number of strokes per length or lengthen your distance per stroke. And that's one way of doing it. The other way is to swim a faster time. So when you lower the number of strokes per length, do that by increasing your body rotation, having a longer reach, improving the timing of your catch versus your kick. Because remember, your kick is ultimately an anchor for your catch. And so the better kick you have and the better timing you have between your kick and your catch, the greater your power is, okay? And that will help you with lowering that score. Increasing shoulder strength and shoulder flexibility is always important for a lot of different reasons, and those two elements also help you to lower this particular score by lowering the number of strokes per length. Okay. But you can also lower that score by increasing how fast you swim that 25. And you can do that by increasing your stroke rate. Okay. But it's not just, again, it's not just a matter of turnover. You want to be sure that you go through a faster accelerated pull and that your recovery is faster in order to increase that rate, improve your kick efficiency. You're also going to make sure that you're not overreaching and that you're finishing appropriately down past the hip. But all of that is accelerated and as a way to help that increasing that stroke rate. But through this, initially, the goal is to maintain your distance per stroke. Don't change that because that will affect your score, but then it ultimately just affects your overall performance. So the goal really is to maintain that distance per stroke while you increase your stroke rate. Because if you maintain the distance per stroke, but you increase the stroke rate, your time's just going to automatically drop, and so then your Zwolf score drops. Okay. All right. So you can kind of see what that might look like in video form. So you have a person here with a very long distance per stroke and very slow stroke rate versus a person here on the right, very appropriate stroke rate and distance per stroke. Okay. Considerations when you talk about Zwolf, definitely lowering the score is better. We mentioned that earlier. There are no norms for this. Cannot really compare yourself against others because there's just so much variation in people's stroke rate and distance per stroke and fitness and how fast you swim. But you can use it for your own self to check your progress. Basically, it's a tool for improvement, and you can do the Zolf assessment over the course of months, just to and even the course of a season to kind of see how you make improvements. And typically, I recommend in Zolf scores to track what your Zolf score is in just the regular sets that you do throughout a training session, and maybe use the same training session on day one, and then 2 months later you do that same exact session and you track what your Zolf score is during those sets, and try to do a Zolf assessment over the course of different types of swim distances, 50s, 100s, 200s, 300 plus distances, and you'll see your scores change based off of the distance, just like you saw it change with stroke rate and distance per stroke. And then you can use that information to determine if you're making improvements over shorter swims, mid-distance swims, and longer swims. Because ultimately, distance per stroke and stroke rate for all swimmers, which is shows up in your Zolf scores, it's based off experience, conditioning, how tall, short you are, your flexibility, biomechanics, and other factors. So certainly being able to make these assessments and making changes that are relative to you are important. So a lot of information in this presentation. I hope you got a lot out of it. Just keep in mind that in order to make changes to your stroke rate, you really have to make changes to your technique and your form, especially as it relates to your reach, your catch, the timing of your kick relative to your catch, how accelerated you are in your stroke, and how much you finish and how far you finish your pull. So there's a lot of different elements going on there, but it's important to make those changes in order to improve your stroke rate. So hope you enjoyed the presentation, and until next time.